Few people reflect Maine better or have done more for the state than Earle G. Shettleworth, Jr. For virtually his entire life, he has been focused on learning about, preserving, and sharing Maine's history. With unwavering focus, he has built an encyclopedic knowledge of Maine, built on a profound respect for the diversity and contributions of its people, communities, and regions. He is an icon to people throughout Maine, a rock star historian with a vast following. He is an advisor and counsel to legislators and civic leaders. He is the leader of our field, a generous mentor to curators, preservationists, and historians of all backgrounds. He is an invaluable guide and collaborator. He is an inveterate sharer and giver. He is a dear friend. It is Maine Historical Society's honor to show our gratitude and appreciation for Earle by telling his Maine story. Like most of us, Earle's Maine story is an immigrant story. His mother's family arrived in Portland in 1893, part of a wave of Danish immigrants. Earle's maternal grandfather, Knud Knudsen, was born in Denmark in 1868. He served in the King's Guard, married, and emigrated to Portland with his young family in 1893. He found work at the Portland Stove Foundry, purchased a home at 56 Hammond Street near Back Cove, and became a U.S. citizen. Tragically, he was widowed and left with 5 young children to raise when he was 32. But soon, he wed Earle's grandmother, Marie Nielsen. Marie was his sister-in-law and in a similar situation. Marie had been widowed in Denmark and emigrated to Portland with her 4 children in 1895. Knud and Marie were married in 1900 and soon had 4 children of their own, including Earle's mother, Esther Knudsen. Esther was born in 1905 into the household on Hammond Street that would soon grow to 13 children.
And they lived down below Nissen's on Hammond Street. Everyone knows Munjoy Hill comes down, you hit Washington Avenue, then it keeps dropping down, then it flattens out. That was all filled in after the fire of 1866. They lived at the bottom of the hill right below Nissen's on the water. We have a photo of them, with a garden and a goat tied up to a fence, and then there's the ocean, and of course now it's all buildings.
Knud was gruff and instilled hard work and frugality in his children. Marie was a softer touch. She was a successful dressmaker, raised and sold produce, and championed education. Esther grew up surrounded by an extended family that was quickly becoming Americanized, moving up and part of a thriving Danish community in Portland. Esther attended Portland High School, graduating in 1923, where she played on and managed the basketball team and was an excellent student. She impressed her teachers, who helped her earn a scholarship to Colby College, where she studied English and made lifelong friends. After graduation in 1927, Esther taught and coached basketball at several high schools, including Scarborough High. She then settled in as an English teacher at Deering High School, where she would teach until her children were born, then substitute, and resume full-time when her children were grown. Meanwhile, most of Earle's father's family were recent immigrants too, from England. They came during the 19th century, pursuing opportunity created by the Industrial Revolution. Earle's grandfather, George Shettleworth, was born in England, moved to Montreal with his family, and settled in Portland, Connecticut in the 1870s, where he went to work for the Pickering Governor Company as a machinist. Earle's paternal grandmother, Emma Jane Bartlett, was the only one of Earle's 4 grandparents who was of old Yankee stock. Her father was a ship captain, Daniel Bartlett, from Madison, Connecticut. George and Emma married in 1879. Earle's father, Earle Shettleworth Sr., was born in Middletown, Connecticut in 1899 and grew up and went to school there. He started working when he was 10, tried many occupations across the Midwest and in New England, and finally, in 1921, went to work for the Woolworths Company at the age of 22. He was trained by Woolworths in New York City and would go on to manage stores throughout New England. In 1933, he was assigned to the store in Portland and moved to Maine. In Portland, he met Earle's mother, Esther Knudsen, and they were married in 1935. The Woolworths store in Portland thrived during World War II as local shipyards and the city's population boomed. Earle Sr. and the family prospered. In 1940, the couple made a big symbolic move for a family of recent immigrants. They built their own home on Hersey Street directly across Back Cove from Esther's parents' house and moved to the suburbs. It was only a short distance away from Hammond Street, but a world away as the family entered the American mainstream. The Portland Woolworths did so well that in 1946 the company decided to transfer Earle's dad outside of Maine. But by then, the family was firmly rooted in Portland and wouldn't leave. In 1946, Earle's father opened his first five and dime store in Freeport under the name E. G. Shettleworth and Company. He was a neighbor, business colleague, and friend of L.L. Bean.
The story is that L.L., my grandfather, he came across the street to greet Earle Shettleworth Sr. before his grand opening. But before he left, he said, "Is there any way that you would be willing to let me put an arrow on top with our name on it on your building pointing across to ours?" And in discussing it, they both thought it might be beneficial. That's Old Route 1. People were coming through there and they'd see both buildings right in the middle of town. So that was an agreement. Mr. Shettleworth wouldn't take any rent. My grandfather took 2 Hudson Bay blankets across the street and gave one to Earle's dad and one to Earle's mother. And that created a really wonderful, warm feeling between the two that continued through the years.
He soon opened 3 more stores in Greater Portland. Earle's parents had become fixtures in the Portland community. In 1943, Earle's sister Sarah was born, and on August 17, 1948, Earle G. Shettleworth Jr. arrived on the scene. Almost from birth, Earle was an historian. He did normal Maine kid things, like riding his bike, swimming, and horsing around. But his interest in history emerged early.
I look back on it now for many years and I realize how extremely fortunate I was. I had an extraordinary pair of parents. By the time I was 4 years old, I was evincing this interest in history. And it really came from the fact that my father brought home from his store this remaindered series called The Illustrated History of Britain that had been published just at the time of World War II, and it somehow made its way across the ocean and into his store in Freeport. And I was just absolutely fascinated going through page after page of these illustrations about British history from the Roman times up into the 19th century, and that kind of hooked me. And so, you know, very quickly they responded to the fact of what I was interested in. And they were marvelous in terms of encouraging it all the way, right up to the time I, left the nest, so to speak, after college. And what I remember in particular in the way of encouragement was the many family trips that we took. There would be day trips, usually on Sundays, and those would be to historic places like Portsmouth, Newburyport, Salem. There would be longer trips to Boston, to Providence, to Newport, to New York, to Washington, to Philadelphia, to Williamsburg, to Mystic, to Sturbridge. I mean, there isn't a place in the Northeast that we didn't go that had historic significance that was part of the process of encouraging my interest.
Starting in 1955, every summer Earle's parents rented a camp in East Madison, near Skowhegan, which enabled his mother to spend time with her Colby friends and provided Earle with a fertile new playground, Central Maine, for exploring Maine and his historical interests. Earle credits a family trip to Quebec when he was 7 as the moment he became a collector.
When we passed through a little town called Bingham, I saw a big antique shop. I said to my parents, on the way back, can we stop there? I really want to go in. And so, they were always very obliging and very supportive. And so we stopped. And it was run by a wonderful old couple named Morris and Barbara Alkins. And it was originally 2 stores that had been merged into one, this great big late 19th century wooden commercial building, just absolutely filled to the gills with everything, with glass, with china, with paintings, with prints, including, of course, as I soon discovered, boxes of stereopticon views at the back, and so on. And so that was my first exposure. I was 6 going on 7, and I picked out this one item that just absolutely transfixed me, and I said to my parents, oh, I want that. So, and they said, well, all right, your birthday is coming up. Your 7th birthday is coming up shortly. And we'll bring you back on your birthday to buy this. Well, what it turned out to be, and I still have it, was a print of Gilbert Stuart's George Washington painting. And it was in a crisscross Victorian frame. It was $2. They really got off cheap that year on my birthday, although I think they gave me other things as well. But you see, I was under the impression that I had found this original painting of George Washington, and I must have it. And so indeed, later on, I opened up the back some years later and found that it was actually the illustration from a 1932 Washington bicentennial calendar. But, I still cherish it to this day. It was my first acquisition.
He began frequenting antique stores and making connections to eminent old Mainers who had stories to tell, knowledge of Maine history, and took interest in the precocious child. Back home in Portland, Earle began to organize and share his collection. He created a museum in his bedroom. In 1961, the Portland Evening Express profiled Earle, then a 7th grader at Lincoln Junior High School. In the article, his mother expresses wonder that there's still room for the bed.
That early collecting already began to fill my room in my parents' house. And it was a very eclectic collection. I mean, it was a mixture of old photographs. There was a statue of a Civil War soldier. There was a photograph of the night staff of the Easton Argus newspaper in the 1880s. There were lots of political campaign buttons. I mean, it was a very eclectic collection. And I remember my sister, who was, among other things, very artistic, she made this beautiful sign that I still have that simply said, E.G. Shettleworth's Museum, and that was posted on the door,
He also shared his collection with his fellow elementary school students, including his Edison phonograph. Earle's principal at the Heseltine School asked his mother, "Why does Earle seem so serious?" His mother responded, "He has a lot on his mind." Earle's first publication, written when he was in 6th grade, was a history of the Heseltine School when it was about to be torn down and replaced by the new Baxter Elementary School. As an 11-year-old, he boldly sought an audience with the new school's namesake, former Governor Percival Baxter, and the two hit it off. As he entered Deering High School, Earle gained a mentor who would have a profound impact on his life. Elizabeth Ring, history teacher, renowned Maine historian, and a driving force at Maine Historical Society. She recognized Earle's interest, passion, and talent. She fed him research projects, nominated him for membership at Maine Historical Society, and gave him opportunities to create exhibits. She introduced him to lifelong friend and collaborator Christopher Monkhouse.
What Elizabeth did for me, even before, I had gotten to Deering High School, that summer of '63 was the first time where I was free to totally explore the Maine Historical Society. And I explored it from top to bottom. I went into nooks and crannies because I had this interest not only in books and manuscripts, but a deep interest in objects.
She also pushed him to do his first lecture on the history of Portland buildings.
We have Elizabeth, I can still see it to this day, coming up to my desk in her class and saying, I have a special assignment for you, she said. You're getting so interested in Portland architecture, because I'd been spending the summer of '63, also doing some of the very first survey work of Portland architecture for Greater Portland Landmarks. And she knew this very well. And she said, I've been asked by the College Club here in Portland to give a talk on old Portland houses. And she said, actually, you're going to do it.
In high school, Earle embarked on a weekly ritual he would maintain for years that transported him back in time. Each Saturday, he made a regular circuit to Portland's antique dealers, antiquarians, and bookmen. During these visits, he befriended a cast of elders who had experienced and built deep knowledge of Maine history. He soaked in their stories and reveled in the centuries-old feel of their shops. Every Saturday morning, he would walk from his house on Hersey Street to Forest Avenue, where he caught a bus to Monument Square. His first stop was at Sam Cinnamon's, who had run a second-hand goods and antiques business since 1925. He then headed to F.O. Bailey's, run by Neil Allen Sr. From there, he visited the Century House, run by Pearl Pine at York and Brackett. After lunch, he'd visit Ruth Boyd's shop on Portland Street. Finally, he'd stop to see another of his great mentors, Francis O'Brien. Francis was a legendary bookman, philosopher, and generous soul who mentored a generation of historians, collectors, book dealers, and people throughout the community.
Francis was probably one of the most learned and erudite and in many ways thoughtful person who lived in Maine in the 20th century. He was there to sell books, but he was also there to impart his vast knowledge. He knew people all over the state because they gravitated to him for books, but also for his knowledge and his perceptions and his viewpoints and his observations. He was a great mentor. In many ways, he was an intellectual father to me.
In high school, Elizabeth Ring also brought Earle into the Sills Committee, the precursor to Greater Portland Landmarks. Landmarks was founded in response to the destruction of Portland's Union Station in 1961, which had had a huge emotional impact and was a wake-up call.
Well, I think the loss of Union Station in 1961 really caught a great many people, not only in Portland but across the state, off guard. Union Station was a magnificent building. It was sort of a grand Beaux-Arts building in the French chateau style. It was sort of the culmination of the success of railroads in Maine in the 19th century. It had been built in the late 1880s. It was really a crossroads for Maine. I think at one point I remember reading that there was somewhere between 80 and 100 trains running through there every day over a 24-hour period. So consequently, Union Station was a place that was really melded into the memories of thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, in a day when railroad transportation was largely the way you traveled. And I think many people had very poignant memories of Union Station because of the wars as well. I mean, this is the station that many of the troops left from to go to training and ultimately to World War I and World War II, and then they returned as well. And so really, it was a place that was really filled with memories that cut across every segment of our lives and our society. And so when Union Station was abruptly destroyed a year after passenger service ended, and apparently the Maine Central Railroad couldn't wait to, just cash in on that piece of property. They sold it. It was destroyed before anyone could do anything about it, and of course became a strip mall, which is now, well, we won't say anymore.
Encouraged by his parents to find a summer job, Earle began writing a series of features for the Portland Evening Express. He would end up writing 52 articles about Portland architecture during his high school and college years. By the time he graduated from high school in 1966, Earle had already delivered 100 lectures on historic buildings in Portland. He had already become one of Maine's leading historians. Like his mother, Earle attended Colby College, where his scholarly interests focused on art history. Earle's interest in art history had been piqued through the encouragement of his friend Christopher Monkhouse in the Colby Art Museum's groundbreaking 1963 exhibition, Maine and Its Role in American Art. By the time Earle was at Colby, he was already in demand as an advisor. Grassroots efforts to preserve the row house and other buildings in Hollowell in the late 1960s marked the start of a statewide historic preservation movement in Maine. It was here that Earle met and launched a lifelong friendship and collaboration with Linda Bean.
I formed a group with some women. There were 8 of us, and we walked around town, took pictures of all the early homes, and worked our way up the hill and tried to date them. When we finished with that and gave that little album of photographs to the library, it occurred to us that we didn't know anything about the commercial buildings. David Stevens, who was then the head of the Department of Transportation, had made it clear that he wanted to tear down the commercial buildings on the river side in order to widen the highway. We didn't want that to happen. We didn't really know enough about the buildings, and I heard that Earle was at Colby. He was already well known as a knowledgeable historic preservationist. By that time, you know, he was on his way to becoming what he is today, a national treasure on Maine history and Maine architecture. So I called and he agreed to come and help us look at those buildings. The problem was he didn't drive. He was in college and he didn't drive yet. No issue. I had children. They were around my ankles at that time, you know, little kids. And we were living in that old house, that old Dummer house, trying to restore it. And I picked him up in my car and brought him down from Waterville. And he stood there and amazed all of us. And he said, you know, we can work with the A95 review process here. That's a federally legislative mandate to investigate which is more important, for example, a highway or the historic buildings. That was how our little group led the way to saving the buildings on that street.
In 1970, Earle served a stint in the U.S. Army Reserve. In 1971, Earle entered the New American Studies program at Boston University. His mentor and friend, Abbott Lowell Cummings, taught in the program and directed the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, now Historic New England. Cummings helped Earle secure Spania's first fellowship, which helped pay for graduate school and provided remarkable research opportunities. By now, Earle was well established and had developed a committed legion of followers. Maine art critic Philip Isaacson described Earle in a 1972 Maine Sunday Telegram article. I could not think of any museum program that has given me as much pleasure as Earle Shettleworth Jr.'s recent lectures on the architecture of Portland. How does one take a lay audience, amenable to architectural history perhaps, but hardly a cadre of experts, and in a few minutes convert them into rows of note-taking building bluffs? He returned to Maine, where the infrastructure and administration of Maine's preservation movement was being put into place. In 1971, Governor Kernus appointed Earle to serve on the first board of the Maine Historic Preservation Commission. He became the commission's architectural historian in 1973 and was named its director in 1976. At 28, Earle was firmly established as a professional historian and leader who already had 2 decades of experience under his belt. For the next 40 years, Earle became the public figure that we all know. Earle traveled throughout Maine constantly, surveying buildings, advising communities, supporting local preservation efforts, providing context and technical guidance, connecting projects to resources, educating and inspiring the public, helping people and communities throughout Maine see and appreciate their part in the Maine story, and commemorating events of local, state, and national significance.
I've known Earle for over 40 years, and some of the first contacts was with establishing a downtown National Register historic district. And, 30 buildings are in the district. 20 of those were designed by the same architect. And, we worked obviously closely with Earle to get that district established.
In Augusta, he became a leader of Maine's burgeoning cultural community. He became a key counsel to legislators, providing historical information and perspective on far-ranging Maine topics.
Look, Earle is industrious, he's kind, he's smart as hell. And I've always been able to call him, even on the spur of the moment, and ask him questions. And he'll come up with the most encyclopedic answers very quickly. Well, that's why it's so important to have people like Earle Shettleworth, and he is one of a kind, to remind us of our history, remind us of what went before. That becomes very important with term limits in the legislature, for instance. People who don't remember what happened 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, what the origin of some particular law or policy is. And that's why we rely sometimes on John Martin and Solomon Millett and others with distinguished careers in public policy. But we also rely on Earle Shettleworth to remind us of our own history, of what we did before, good, bad, or indifferent.
With Earle, we can obviously go into centuries, indeed millennia of Maine history. But Earle himself, because of the many years he spent working with it and the people that he's known, is a link to history. He has known as a child Maine Civil War veterans. He can bring together that enormous arch and horizon of Maine history, and offers stability from one political administration to another, from one group of people to another.
He advocated for financial support for preservation of Maine's built environment, including a barnstorming tour throughout the state in 1985 for a $2 million bond. He helped lead the effort to restore the Maine State House in 1998-2001 and collaborated closely with First Lady Karen Baldacci to restore the Olmsted-designed New England Garden at the Blaine House in 2006-2007. During Earle's tenure, the Maine Historic Preservation Commission nominated approximately 1,600 Maine properties to the National Register of Historic Places and awarded millions of dollars in federal and state grants for the preservation of historic buildings and archaeological sites. Its surveys have identified critical historic, architectural, and archaeological resources. In recognition of these many contributions, Earle was named Maine State Historian by Governor Baldacci in 2004, a role in which he continues to serve.
I think, Steve, it was probably the greatest privilege of my life. I think that I had learned early on, particularly through the role model of Governor Baxter and having the opportunity to meet and talk with him several times during the 1960s when I was very young and he was very old. The idea of the deep importance of public service and the fact that public service at its best can be a force for great good. And that is, I think, what guided me all through those 40 years. There were great moments of accomplishment, there were great moments of challenge, as there is in any job or any endeavor. I was involved in a number of very challenging preservation battles, and at the same time, some great preservation victories.
Earle's leadership of the preservation movement is just one dimension of his historical contributions to Maine. His role as a collector, historian, mentor, and teacher has had an equally important impact. The collecting Earle did as a child and teen gave him a sharp eye and foundation of knowledge. His collecting has continued unabated. From the 1960s into the 1990s, Earle scoured Maine with another important mentor and friend, James Vickery. Vickery, born in Unity in 1917, was a teacher who had been collecting early photographs of Maine since before World War II. Jim didn't drive, but by the early 1970s, Earle did. Earle regularly served as Jim's chauffeur for collecting jaunts throughout Maine. The collecting that they did individually and together forms the basis of one of Earle's legacy collections. The Vickery Shettleworth collection of early Maine photography, which was established at Maine Historical Society in 2006. During his tenure in Augusta, Earle built another legacy collection, the Maine Historic Preservation Commission Photographic Collection. This collection of stereo views and real photo postcards spans from the 1850s to the 1950s and provides an invaluable, sprawling record of Maine's built and natural environment.
The Maine Historic Preservation Commission's collection is probably one of the most important collections in New England. It amounts to somewhere north of 20,000 stereo views of Maine, certainly well over 100,000 postcards. I wouldn't even dare guess how many glass negatives or mounted photographs. The magnitude is remarkable. And this really was Earle's baby. And I think one of the most important things that will be part of his legacy is, as the State Historic Preservation Officer, he had a bureaucratic role, but he also amassed a collection that makes Maine's State Historic Preservation Office absolutely unique.
Our historic buildings and historic places just do an enormous amount towards establishing, a sense of place anywhere. And I think that and those buildings also, if you are designing a building to be in the vicinity of a historic building, you learn a lot and hopefully relate the new work to the old work.
Working closely with Maine museums and close collaborators like Linda Bean, Earle has worked to make sure that critical collections, like the Maine Charitable Mechanics banners, stayed in Maine and accessible to the public, and didn't disappear into the hands of private, out-of-state collectors. Through Earle's efforts, a vast, precious record of Maine has been saved, preserved, and established.
I think one of the great things about Earle is that he understands the value of things. And it doesn't matter if it's a drawing or a photograph or a piece of ephemera. And even though his career was largely in historic preservation and the built environment, he always knows how to make connections across different disciplines. So art or architecture or material culture or social history. And I think it's being able to make those kinds of connections that make objects and things, more relevant today.
Earle has also documented and shared the vast personal knowledge that he has built through the publication of countless books, articles, and exhibitions on topics ranging from Maine artists to photography to the histories of numerous communities. Earle has delivered 40-plus lectures per year throughout Maine for decades and shared his knowledge through thousands of conversations with colleagues, researchers, and students. His lectures have turned the public, non-historians, into avid fans, history buffs, and champions of their own communities.
He understands that interpretations of various things are changing, or activating in a collection in a particular way in 2023 is not the same way it would have been done in 1980 or 1990. And he's still here for that, right? Looking at that, pushing at those interpretations, finding more evidence, never just sitting and resting on what he already knows, like always seeking to know more.
One of the great things about Earle is that I think he's one of the most productive people I've ever met. He's not distracted by dog walking. He's not distracted by watering your house plants or mowing the lawn. And he is passionate about, focusing on the research and getting things written and distributed.
Earle is just so generous. I mean, I've never seen an instance where someone asked Earle to come speak or to do something, to look something up, that he doesn't do it. He just, he's always right there. It's amazing.
Earle is always happy to leverage his abilities and his connections for somebody else's benefit too. And I think that's really a unique characteristic of Earle.
Here's someone who, with laser focus and a very high level of talent and intellect, has done the same thing in the same place in public service for decades, at a level that's significant nationally.
We have briefly met some of the mentors, peers, and colleagues who imparted the knowledge and experience that they built over their own lifetimes with Earle. Earle, in turn, has generously and enthusiastically shared the knowledge he has built. Thousands of people across Maine, ranging from local historians to preservationists to scholars to curators and archivists to teachers to municipal and civic leaders, now carry forth his knowledge and spirit.
Earle's an incredible friend. He is one who I think really values relationships with others. He's somebody who, if he meets somebody who shares his passion, wants to support that person in any way he can. Over and over again, I'm just sort of blown away by his generosity of spirit. And he's an incredibly valued member of our community. And thank you, Earle, for everything that you've done.
Earle celebrates local knowledge and has patiently mentored communities and organizations as they have preserved collections, saved buildings, curated exhibits, built capacity, and gathered and shared their stories. Earle's life work has coincided with a 75-year time window when Maine's history and record may have been most at risk, a time when centuries-old farmsteads and homes were being dispersed, and photos, letters, journals, and plans might easily have simply disappeared. A time when much of Maine, seeking to modernize, might have simply bulldozed or torn down thousands of buildings that now remain, and which are central to Maine's sense of place and the spirit and identity of towns, villages, and cities throughout the state.
It really comes down to a lot about, what makes Maine Maine. And I think without Earle, Maine would be a decidedly lesser place, and I think it would be certainly less, quote unquote, Maine.
Earle has done all of this with generosity, a sense of humor, and a smile on his face. The collections, knowledge, and perspectives that Earle has saved, stewarded, and imparted document what makes Maine, Maine, and provide a sense of wonder and foundation of knowing that will be critical to Maine's vitality in its third century.